Hey everybody, this is Perch, and people have been asking for a bit of time how ESG is impacting comics. So you might be asking yourself, what is ESG? And the answer is actually a lot more complicated than you think. And the challenge is right now, ESG investing is pulled into the culture war, and so you're seeing a lot of very knee-jerk reactions, both pro and con. The Heritage Foundation has a very kind of shaking fist ESG, woke capitalism is ruining everything. And then Slate has an article about how ESG is a Republican boogeyman. And the reality is a lot of people want you to kind of ignore some of the details of ESG, particularly about the S part of ESG. So let me try and explain a little bit what this is, because it is complicated. And if you go and do research, you're going to be in for a hell of a time. So first off, I want to ground you with some history for a second. So first of all, what is ESG? If you've been hearing that term, ESG is ruining comics, ESG is ruining entertainment. So ESG is basically, what it stands for is environmental, social, and governance. And those are three pillars, meaning three investment criteria that goes into an ESG rating. An ESG rating is completely different from China's social score, if you've heard about that, which uses other metrics. But it basically says that investment firms can take into account environmental, social, and governance factors to evaluate companies and countries on how far advanced they are with sustainability. Now, it's really important to pause there for a moment, because where most of the investing is happening and where most of the factors are here are on the E and the G. The S, initially, when ESG investing really came about in the early 2000s, I think around 2004, the S meant social responsibility to the environment. It did not mean social like pronouns and racial aspects. That came a little later. When ESG first started, it was about environmental and it was about governance. And what it began as, and this is a really important point, is that investment firms had for a long time judged investments based on their take on tobacco, based on coal plant and other aspects of their energy production, energy use. How were they optimizing their warehouses? This has been going on for 50, 60 years. And so the environmental part of it came kind of, again, early 2000s, and it was basically saying, are these companies looking at reducing waste? And when you say reducing waste, it's really important to note here that we're not talking about kind of 2020, how people are talking about waste, like some people are talking about kind of urban centers and just basic human reproduction as waste. And I suppose in some of these areas it is. That's a joke, sort of. But it's like you take a manufacturing plant and it's saying how much of this manufacturing plant is moving toward automation, how much of it is moving toward more solar or things that are going to help the overall company use less electricity. And remember, this is for investment. So environmental was, a factor in how much spend the company was going to have for power production, plant, everything else. That is how it began. Now, what has kind of evolved is the S, social, stopped being about social governance to the environment, to social governance toward how a business is run, and started to migrate. So let me read you real quick the initial definition of social in ESG, and this comes directly from the initial filings. It said, social includes human rights, labor standards in the supply chain, and exposure to illegal child labor, and more routine issues such as adherence to workplace health and safety. That was the social. And it's important for you to kind of remember that and ground yourself on that, because if you turn on the news right now, ESG is about woke attacks on society and how many different alphabet letters of the LGBTIQ community they're employing and all the rest. But that again is not how it evolved. And if you think about the entire point of ESG, it was designed for investors to understand their investment. It was not for them to feel good. Now, feel good about their investment, but not, any of this other kind of stuff. So things definitely shifted, but that is how it began. It began with these factors. And I will say on the offset, as an investor, these were good metrics to look at. Is a company moving toward automation? That means a company is thinking about long-term sustainability of its business. Is it making sure that it's got good labor standards? Well, that means a company is not going to have a strike anytime soon or try to form a union. These are valuable things. But slowly but surely, ESG started to migrate. And it started to migrate like all things over the last 10 years, and particularly the last 6 or so, with the hypersensitivity of politics. And so ESG investing started to change. In particular, the S, social, started to increase quite a bit to mean, how many people of color serve on your management team, what kind of pride funding are you doing, are you investing in the community, and in particular, the George Floyd entire situation, everything that fell out of it, started to heavily play into ESG. And it's at that point, and this is really, really important because this is, again, not something you're going to hear on the really loud people shouting at you about the dangers of ESG. At that point, many large investing firms stopped caring about ESG, and they went back to just basic environmental quality control. Again, if you look at the major investment firms, more and more of them are dropping out of ESG and going back to the original guidance, which is, how are they basically handling their business? And so that's kind of how ESG has shifted. By the way, there's one story right now, and it kind of, in my mind, sums up a lot of the whole ESG situation. Ron DeSantis has just recently, in the last couple of days, really started to attack woke capital with what he's calling an ESG crackdown. So the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, who expected to be a presidential candidate, basically said he will bar ESG-oriented investment funds in the state's pension plan. So basically saying, hey, if the state's $240 billion pension fund will no longer be used to invest in stocks based on ESG measures. But here is the problem. It definitely was popular with his base and with his donors, but here is the situation. The state pension board, the State Board of Administration, doesn't and cannot invest based on ESGs or really any metrics of those kind. They can't use these factors as part of the pension. And most government-controlled sites, not most, I think that they go into laws about how you can invest and what factors you can use. These kinds of metrics and ratings are not allowed. What's happening overall with ESGs, as I mentioned, is that the large investment firms are largely walking away from it. Now, that doesn't mean that companies like Disney in particular are not touting their social scores. And in many cases, they're touting their ESG, but what they're really touting is their various efforts in the LGBTQ community, things about the environment, because the company believes those are marketable. But as an investment, fewer and fewer people are paying attention to it. So this is a culture war aspect. Now, to the question a lot of people ask, how is this affecting comics? And is this why you're seeing a lot of creators, introduce more diversity, more LGBTQ, all that kind of stuff? And the answer is no. ESG has zero impact in this. And there's one key reason why. ESGs, if you're talking about ESG as an investment, are designed for investing. And, no offense, none of these companies are public companies. Now, Marvel wraps up under Disney, and Disney is certainly touting these things, but Disney is doing it from a larger corporate perspective. The ESG factor is a non-factor. And you may have heard elsewhere, but honestly, go look at legitimate funds that have Disney as part of their hedge portfolio and count up how many are ESG run firms. The answer is less than 5%. So Disney is doing this all on their own. ESG is not the factor there. And DC, Marvel, and then certainly, Image is not a public company. If they are doing things to try and raise their social profile, the ESG has no bearing on it. There is no ESG fund to invest into. It's an independent company. They do also, bear in mind, if you have a high ESG score, that simply means that the investment portfolio can look at you as a potential target to recommend to investors. It does not mean that some magical entity just goes around and hands you money. There's this big misconception that if you have a high ESG score, the government comes in and basically recommends you. And that's not how ESGs work. So I'm not saying that the social stuff doesn't exist. I'm certainly not saying these companies aren't doing this to kind of promote their own social talking points and everything else. They clearly are. So definitely. But the ESG bit is not a factor. It's not how. It's just not. It's not how these things work. So I think that, if you're looking right now, again, it's a big talking point, and the idea is that, hey, these woke companies are creating an ESG score, and they're forcing companies to comply to various standards. And yes, there are certainly, some. There are certainly some factors that are doing that, but it's first of all, it's definitely not a factor of comics. Bluntly, comics are too small. They're not publicly traded. They don't matter in this sense. At the higher level, at the Warner level, Discovery, Disney, these companies may be pursuing these agendas, these efforts, but the investment portfolio that's going on this, it's less than 5%. By and large, ESG is it's fascinating. ESG was designed to be a tool, as I mentioned, to assess health and profitability of the company. And this comes directly from the people who founded ESGs. And in many ways, it was an end to bring a stop to chaos that had been going on, where you had a bunch of different investment firms using a bunch of random criteria, which, as I said before, included things like, do public officials, smoke tobacco products in public? It was chaos. So they created some standards around what it would mean to have a sustainable business, sustainable in the sense of, a basic capitalism, not sustainable in the sense of pursuing, untested energy forms. But again, ESG has grown massively. It has become, as many call it, a Frankenstein. ESG investing certainly brings a lot of money to it. Last count, about $2.8 trillion in assets worldwide. But it's still vague, and it's still incredibly confusing exactly what it does and what it brings about and who is actually caring about it. I think the key here is, if you're looking for a smoking gun to say, why in the world are these big companies pursuing some of these very left-wing aspects to their business, the answer is in the company. The answer is not in some kind of ESG boogeyman that's pushing this. It is very easy to basically ignore ESG, and particularly for large companies, and do just fine. They're doing it on their own. I think this is kind of a direct quote from one of the founders of ESGs, who said, there's the good news is there is a large adoption and understanding and accepting of ESGs. The difficult part, she added, is that because it bloomed very quickly, there are lots of pockets, including managers and asset owners, who may have a very narrow view and may not be practicing ESG investing to the same extent of many of the original practitioners had intended. So what does that mean? It means there are funds set up by people who are left-wing or political, who are trying to basically invest in a way that matches their politics. And they basically co-opted a lot of what ESG is and enhanced the S in all this. So the general consensus, by the way, is this. And I think this is a kind of another interesting quote from one of the other founders of ESG. It said, everybody and their brother wants to do it. Everything is ESG across the map. None of these companies are reducing carbon emissions that much compared to what they claim they should have. They're just going for the press release. It's dead in the water without policy. And that's pretty accurate. This has turned into another spin item. But if you're wondering, again, is ESG responsible for turning Iceman gay, for example? No, not at all. That. If you want to find somebody to blame, the blame sits at the feet of the writer and the editors who decided they wanted to do that. not because they're trying to get magic money out of someone. And there is no magic government fund that's just helping people say, if you're woke enough as a company, we're going to hand you cash. That's certainly not what's happening. And these comic companies are not massively losing money, but being propped up by ESG funds. They don't qualify for ESG funds. If Disney is getting investment from ESG firms, that's going to Disney, the parent company. It's certainly not going to Marvel. Anyway, it's a complicated topic. You can look into it, but you're in for a spider web of a mess where ESGs are concerned. There's just a lot there to it. But good luck. See what you can find out. Definitely over the next year to 2 years, you're going to hear a lot more about ESGs. Ron DeSantis doing this. It's definitely signaling it's going to be part of the next, the midterms, part of the presidential debate. You're going to hear a ton about it. Interestingly enough, the more you hear about it, the less of a factor it probably is. Thanks for listening.